Hi, my name is Amalia Weber. I am the program specialist at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's Zoom program, An Evening with Frederick Douglass. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly thereafter. For the duration of tonight's program, the audience will remain muted and unable to unmute themselves. After Mr. Douglass's presentation, there will be a Q&A opportunity in which the audience can ask questions via Zoom's chat feature. From there, I will present the questions as a moderator for Mr. Douglass to answer. I will leave a message in the chat box around the start of the Q&A so everyone will know where to find it. Additionally, we do ask the audience members leave their cameras off to avoid distracting others from the presentation. All right. Our next program will be the Women's Heart Disease and Health Talk presented by Ascension Providence Rochester Hospital, which will be an in-person program on Tuesday, February 15th. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. We would like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library and their many fundraising efforts. It's thanks to their support that we can provide wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. And without further ado, please welcome our speaker, Mr. Frederick Douglass.
Well, thank you, ma'am, Master of Ceremony. And thank you to the Rochester Hills Public Library and the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library. We certainly could have not done things in our time without great benefactors. And so I am here with unusual diffidence to be talking to this modern audience with the advent of technology. Certainly John Duragraph, when he invented the Duratype camera, would not have believed how small his invention has become. Well, I am yours truly, Frederick Douglass. I was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on the Eastern Shore in Talbot County near St. Michael's, along the Tuckahoe River. I was born around the year 1818 as slaves at that time did not know the dates of their births. The closest we could come would be planting time or harvest time, cherry time. Slave masters didn't want you to have any knowledge whatsoever. An educated slave is a worthless slave. And so you will find out as I talk about my narrative that I had to learn on my own. I think the great Mark Twain once said, don't let your schooling get in the way of your education. And I took that to heart. And so all my education came from that as a self-made man. Now, I was born on that plantation and taken away from my mother even before I finished nursing, as was the custom in any plantation. A child born, unless this child was born conceived by the slave master, normally that woman would be sold to another plantation, and so was my mother, in spite of the fact, sold to a plantation about 12 miles away. I never saw her during the light of day. She would occasionally walk 24 miles round trip just to rock me to sleep at night. And by the time I woke the next morning, she'd be gone back to the plantation to answer the bell, to work in the fields. And I can remember once or twice her coming, and once even that she brought me a heart-shaped cake. And she called me her little Valentine. And so without any other knowledge about when my birthday might be, I decided to celebrate my birthday on February 14th, on Valentine's Day. So right around the corner, a few days from now, I'll be celebrating my birthday, 204 years old. And I do look quite fit for 204, do I not? Well, obviously someone in the library opened a book and asked me to come and speak to you. Now, on this plantation, certainly, it was quite severe. In the states of Maryland and Virginia, not quite as much as those plantations down south in Mississippi or Alabama. Certainly, if you were a slave, either bought and sold down there or born down there into bondage. We call that the valley of the shadow of death. And you would certainly had a horrific time trying to escape from down south. But as you might find out, and if you might have read already of my narrative, that I did manage to escape. Now, I was on that plantation for about 6 years. My mother passed away. There was I was not even permitted to attend her funeral, did not know what was the cause of her death. The news of her death came to me much that of a stranger. But one of my good fortunes was that my master's wife, Mrs. All, called me and said, we're going to send you to Baltimore to live with our cousins, Mr. Hugh and Sophia All. Now, they are city people and we don't want them laughing at you. So we want you to go down to the creek and wash yourself up, and we're going to send you to Baltimore. And so I got my first pair of pants around 8 years old. Can you imagine that? You see, the rations given to a family on a plantation were quite meager, scarce even. A family, the adults working in the fields would have received, I have it here in my narrative. I wrote 3 narratives in my lifetime. Narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, My Bondage and My Freedom, and Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And so in this first narrative, I'm accounting here for what would have been to be your rations for a family on the plantation. 8 pounds of pork or its equivalent of fish or a week. And certainly, I did say or, not and so if you receive fish, you did not receive pork. If you receive pork, you did not receive fish. And the mother would have had to cook it very well because many times that meat might have been spoiled. You were getting the leftovers. As far as clothing, the adults would have received 1 coat, 1 pair of trousers, 2 linen shirts, and 1 pair of shoes, the whole of which could have cost no more than $7. The children, like myself, and girls, boys and girls, would have received neither coat, nor trousers, nor shoes. 2 linen shirts per year. And when those fail you, you'd have went naked for the rest of the year, regardless of the weather. And so you see, it was quite a severe situation. And in the wintertime, I slept with a burlap bag over my head. The ground was cold, and many times I got frostbite in the winter. But I managed to get out of that plantation, and they sent me to Baltimore to live with my master's cousins, Hugh and Sophia All. Now, they lived in Baltimore, and they had not owned slaves before. And so they were not in the condition to treat me so roughly. And when I can remember arriving and knocking on the door, and Mrs. All coming to the door, I was quite surprised that a white woman would be smiling, beaming at me, as a matter of fact, saying, "Come on in, Freddie. We've been waiting for you." And I was to be the helpmate for their young son, his butler, so to speak, to Master Anthony was going to be maybe a year older than I, but I was to be his butler and prepare his bath water in the night, fetch it out in the morning, walk him to school and back. These were the tasks. Now, the great fortune was that Mrs. All, who had a very kind and generous spirit, loved to read and write. And so she would sit in her rocking chair and read the Bible, the newspaper, and she risked her reputation to teach me a few ABCs, a few letters. And of course, once I had a few words to describe my misery as a slave, you see, when you can't read or write, you have thoughts swirling around in your head. In the case of being in bondage, you have confusion rolling around in your head, and with no words to describe that misery, then you're baffled. But once you have a few words to describe that misery, your mind becomes free, and thus your body has to follow. You cannot enslave a freed mind. And so, as the master said, an educated slave is a worthless slave. And I can remember that I started to become quite unruly. Her husband, Mr. All, realized that she was teaching me how to read and write, and I distinctly remember one night him coming to her saying, "Do not teach that boy how to read. you know it's against the rules. If you give a nigger an inch, he'll take an L. And so from that point on, she refused to teach me how to read. As a matter of fact, she wanted to do better than her husband asked. And I would be in a room somewhere quiet, maybe striking a match or a candle, trying to read in my notebook. And she would walk right in and snatch the paper right out of my hand. And so I was quite disturbed that I was not allowed to read anymore. And even more so, that they would send me back to the plantation, try to break my spirit. And so they put me under the servitude of a notorious slave breaker by the name of Mr. Edward Covey. Now, this was Mr. Covey's occupation and his reputation, that he would break the spirit of any robust slave. And so I was there, and I was supposed to be there for a year. I went there on New Year's Day and was supposed to stay until Christmas Eve of the next year. And I, for the first time, saw hard labor and the lash on a regular basis. So much so that I really was about to give up. I can remember sitting on his lawn there, just a few blades from the Chesapeake Bay. And the only thing that gave me any kind of hope were the ships sailing, the white sails of the ship billowing on the Chesapeake Bay heading north. And those were really the only signs of hope that I had at that time. Until something came over me and I decided to fight back. It was kind of a peculiar Sunday that Mr. Covey had gone to church and he was coming back, and I saw him. I was sitting on his porch and he came across the yard and he said, "Freddie, need you to meet me in the barn. We're going to throw down some blades." I thought this was quite peculiar that we'd be throwing down some blades on a Sunday. We're normally off. Well, when I walked into the barn, there he stood with a rope and a lash. And he was fixing to tie me in and whip me. And for what, I don't know, slave master did not need any reason whatsoever to give you a lash. But at that moment, I decided I would fight back. And I did fight back, and we fought for almost an hour. Well, he says that he taught me a lesson. But I assure you that I was the winner of that fight. I drew blood from him, and he did not draw it from me. As a matter of fact, he could have certainly taken me down to the whipping post at St. Michael's. But of course, that would have exposed his failure to teach me a lesson. And so he would have ruined his reputation, and thus his enterprise would have been spoiled. And so for the rest of the time I was on that plantation, I went unmolested. And so I sent me back to Baltimore, and now I'm around 16 years old. And Mr. Hewall, he decided he was going to farm my time out to the shipyards there in Fells Point. And so I was working in the shipyards and then shining some shoes for my pence that I could save for myself. You see, at that time, the wage in a shipyard for a ship's caulker was about $9. And I would make that money, my labor, my time, and then I would have to give it to Mr. All, and he would have the audacity to hand me back 6 cents out of $9. 6 cents. And so still bondage. And so I said, I'm going to get out of this situation. And I started making every opportunity that I could to figure out a way that I could get out of that bondage. As a matter of fact, I can remember I'm still trying to learn how to read and write. I'm using every method I can, even in the shipyard as they were bringing in the timbers on the ships. L for larboard, S for starboard, SA for starboard aft. And so I'm understanding the letters and reading and writing as much as I could. I'm shining shoes on the streets of Baltimore. I can remember shining shoes. The call was, 5 cents to shine you, sir, and 1 cent to dust you off. And I saved 75 cents. And I purchased this book. It's called the Columbian Orator. I don't know. You can see this book through this modern technology, but in this book, this is the book that the school boards were taking to school at the time. It's full of great speeches and poems and such. And so this is a very valuable book as far as learning is concerned. And I took to it right off, put my whole head into it and my whole mind. And this one of the first poems in this book as well, and I'm a great lover of poetry, was a poem that I recited many times in order to test my memory and my oratory. I might do it for you here. I don't know if there are any children in the audience. I can't see you through this technology, but if you are there, you might want to repeat along with me. This would be, I don't know if you're familiar with call and response, but I will say the line, and then you just repeat the line after me. So this is the poem. You'd scarce expect one of my age to speak in public on the stage. And if I chance to fall below Demosthenes or Cicero, don't view me with a critic's eye, but pass my imperfections by. Large streams from little fountains flow, tall oaks and little acorns grow. And though I now am young and small, of judgment weak and feeble tongue, yet all great learned men like me once learned to read their ABC. Yes, and so you do that a few times over, and you'll be teaching yourself something. You will develop an ability for recitation and oration. Now, of course, I'm getting more and more frustrated with this bondage of working my hard labor and having to give away all my earnings to someone else. And so, fortunately, on the weekends, we were allowed to go down to what we call the camp meetings. And this is where Blacks, free and enslaved, if you had permission, would go on the weekends and sing songs and have church and such. And at the camp meeting, I met my future wife, Anna Mary. Now, she was already a free woman. She was the first of 8 children to be free. And so we devised a plan in which I would escape. She would help me dress up as a sailor. She sold her bedposts, as a matter of fact, so that I would have money for a train. And I would dress up as a sailor, catch a train from Baltimore to Annapolis, and then from Annapolis, a ship up to New York. And the plan worked well. It certainly worked well. And I arrived in New York, barren, no money, no place to stay, no food, and no one to trust. Hard to even trust a Black man when you have bounty hunters bribing other Black men to turn you in. And so I was very fearful of who I might be talking to. And I sent a telegram, and then in quick order, Anna showed up in New York, and then we made our way to New Bedford, Massachusetts. Now, we arrived in New Bedford, and we are living with one of the people of the Underground Railroad, a family, Nathan and Polly Johnson. Now, and so we're there, and they're taking care of us. And well, at the time, I had changed my name as a runaway to Frederick Johnson, and I'm living with a Johnson. And it seems that everyone had ran away. The popular name was Johnson. And I told Mr. Johnson, I said, I'm going to have to find a new name. I might get lost in the fray here in New Bedford. And so he was reading a book of the time. You might have, this is a classic book, even for our time, Lady of the Lake. And in that Irish tale, the main character's name is Douglas. And so I decided to use that name. It sounds quite fitting. I did add an S, so a Douglas with 2 S's. And of course, he introduced us to a fine minister, Reverend Pennington. And I can remember that Anna was wearing a plume-colored dress, so we got married. We moved to Lynn, Massachusetts, and we started to raise our family. And this is where I met William Lord Garrison and the Garrisonians. They were staunch abolitionists, non-voters. They had a peculiar way of attacking the abolitionists, the Confederates. They thought that they could change the course of the nation through moral suasion. Well, time would prove that that wouldn't work. But I did. I was following them and reading their newspaper, the Liberator newspaper, and I attended one of their conventions, and they asked me to stand up and speak, and I did. I stood up and spoke. I think it was on Nantucket. We were on the Nantucket Island, and I gave my first speech, and it was warmly, rousingly received. Yes, I can remember Mr. John A. Collins introducing me that day. He said, introducing a man who is a graduate of the peculiar institution of slavery with his diploma written on his back. And so that started my career as an orator. It was almost short-lived. They were actually questioning my authenticity. They said, you say he can read, he speaks, he doesn't sound like a slave. And so this is where I was encouraged to write my first novel. I did write a novella, but the truth is better than fiction. And so my first narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, was printed, and then I actually had to leave the country. They put me on a ship, sailed me to Liverpool. I was only supposed to be in Ireland for 4 days. I ended up staying there for 4 months, and then on to England, where I was traveling all over England. They had already abolished slavery in England, and so I felt quite at home. They were treating me not as chattel property, but as a man, as an equal. And they helped me out considerably. They negotiated with my master over those 21 months for my freedom. $733.13 was the sum paid for my freedom. And then they raised another $2,500, $2,500 for me to start a newspaper. And then just before I'm about to leave, they give me a proposition that certainly tested my integrity. They said, Mr. Douglass, why even go back to America? Why go back to a country that enslaves people? We'll raise more money for you. We'll help you buy a home and some land. We'll send for your family. You can stay here and live out the rest of your life with your family. Well, that might be what some men choose to do, but I had left my grandmother. I was hoping that she was still alive. My brother, Perry, sister, Eliza, whole millions of men and women in bondage. And so for that reason, I came back and I decided I would fight for the abolition of slavery. And so I scooped up my family, moved from Lynn to Rochester, and I spent about a couple of decades in Rochester, working alongside the suffrage movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. As a matter of fact, when I first moved to Rochester, I was right across the street from Susan B. Anthony's father and her brother. And that's the way I eventually met Susan B. Anthony, is through her father and her brother. I was on one side of Main Street with my newspaper, and they were on the other with their insurance business. And so those were formidable years in Rochester. And of course, during that time, I'm speaking widely, including Michigan. I certainly came to Michigan in 1850s, 57, 58, 59, 60, and then even after the Civil War. But particularly in Detroit, I had one of the meetings with John Brown in Detroit around 1859. He was quite riled up in 1859. It's just a few months before the raid on Harper's Ferry. And he was trying his best to convince me that the only way we were going to abolish slavery was to go to arms. He was not afraid of that. I spoke I was in Saginaw, so many different cities in the Detroit area. And so, of course, eventually I ended up, my last meeting with John Brown was in Pennsylvania. And I eventually decided, told Mr. Brown, Captain Brown, that I would not go on the raid. And I said, it's a steel trap. It's the perfect steel trap. You see, he had wavered. He had decided to go against what the initial plan that the Secret Six had been financing for him. You see, John Brown was financed by 6 wealthy individuals. And this is how he got his arms, his supplies, and so forth. And the raid on Harper's Ferry was not the initial plan, but he, being the man he was, very, ready to fight, fought down in Kansas, over in Kansas, helping the settlers out there. So I said, this is a perfect steel trap. And he ended up, you hopefully know the story if you know your history, that he was captured and assassinated, hung by the neck, his body buried in the Adirondacks. There's a poem, I hope I'm not taking too much time, but there's a poem, I don't want to digress, but Herman Melville wrote this poem that captures quite profoundly the hanging of John Brown. Hanging from the beam, slowly swaying, such the law. Gaunt the shadow on your green, Shenandoah. The cut is on the crown, lo John Brown, and the stab shall heal no more. Hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw. So your future veils its face, Shenandoah. But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, meteor of the war. Herman Melville was a genius. He was a fortune teller. He literally predicted that this raid on Harper's Ferry would be the meteor that started the Civil War. The Confederates were up. They were, oh my goodness, slaveholders were shaking in their boots. And they certainly wasted no time killing John Brown, and found documents on him associated with me. And then I became a fugitive as well. I ended up leaving the country again to England, but I ended up coming back. My daughter, Annie, she passed away. She was around 11 years old. And when I got a telegram, then I came back. And by that time, the war was so close, they had forgotten about Frederick Douglass. They were getting prepared to fight a war. Now, Civil War, I am lobbying Abraham Lincoln. I'm telling all his cabinet, his generals, if we, the Black man, fought in the Revolutionary War, and we did, the Black men of Massachusetts, Crispus Attucks, the Ethiopian Regiment, even a woman, Mom Bet. If Black people fought for the founding of the country, we should certainly be allowed to fight to save the Union. And so eventually, Mr. Lincoln saw it our way, either out of prudence or just a strategy that he saw fit to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, it wasn't the first time in American history that an Emancipation Proclamation was written. Maybe somebody asked me about that later, but nevertheless, the history proves we are here today, all enjoying our liberty, our democracy. Even still, this country is but an infant compared to countries that live 1,000 years or more. We are still, this country is still in its infancy, and this is the modern era. I believe it's the year of our Lord, hard to believe, 2022. Mind-boggling. I wouldn't have believed it if someone had predicted I would one day go on a mission to the moon. And so after the Civil War, I accomplished some things. I moved my family from Rochester. I ended up purchasing a nice home in Washington, D.C. I became the provost, U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia. I was the president of the Freedmen's Bank and Trust. I was eventually appointed the ambassador to Haiti. They tried to give it to me earlier, but I said there's a better man for the job, John Mercer Langston. Let him serve. And then after his term, they came right back to me, and so I took the appointment as the ambassador to Haiti. And of course, I continued to fight for all the freedoms that we were not guaranteed in the Constitution. You understand that the United States Constitution, this document that I carry right here in my breast pocket, it is not a dead letter. It is a living idea. Now, if you think it's a dead letter, then you might as well, in some cases, give up on it. As a matter of fact, that's why William Lloyd Garrison said it's a flawed document. It should be torn up and rewritten. Well, that was before I was able to read the document for myself. And I realized that the Constitution is not a flawed document. It is, in fact, a great idea. And as long as we live up to that ideal, then we can have progress. And so after the Civil War, we are fighting for the 13th Amendment, the citizenship, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, and eventually the right to vote. The woman's right to vote and the man's right to vote. Unfortunately, the women had to stand aside. It was not their time. And so these are the things that I fought for in my lifetime, risked my life many times just to give a speech. And I was certainly not by myself. There were many on that journey with me: Harriet Tubman, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Grimke sisters, William Steele, and so many others. And so I certainly would not want to take all the credit, although I have received great credit for my accomplishments. As a matter of fact, Harriet Tubman, when she wrote her narrative, she sent me a letter written by her co-author asking me to endorse her book. And I responded by saying, I have received so many accolades for standing in public and being adorned by so many thousands in an audience, while you, Harriet Aminato, your only audience has been the stars at night as you scurried runaways through thickets and briars and swamps to make their way all the way from Virginia to Rochester. I woke up one night in the middle of the night in Rochester on South Street, and here stands Harriet Tubman with 11 runaways. They're trying to make their way into Canada and to the Don colony up there, established by Josiah Henson. Yeah, so these are the many things that went on. Some of the things that have gone on in our time. I don't know what is happening in your modern era. Certainly, Mark Twain said, "History may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes." And so, yes, I don't want to dialogue too long. I know the modern audience had a short attention span. I would refer to my master of ceremony here, mistress of ceremony. Maybe I might have time to give a short speech, ma'am.
Yes, sir.
Maybe
You
four
got
minutes
as
or
much
so,
time.
and then we can take questions. Yes,
Yes.
yes. So I certainly, there were so many things in my lifetime, so many speeches that I gave. The speech on Haiti, self-made men, what to the American slave is the 4th of July, an oration on the memory of Abraham Lincoln, the suffrage speech, Just trying to think of what speech I might give tonight. Certainly one that might explain my learned ability to work across the aisle with people that we may have had a common interest, but did not agree on everything. This is essential. You should, if I had anything for this modern audience, it would be that you would not sacrifice progress for purity. Don't sacrifice progress for purity. There are going to be people in the coalition who do not agree on everything, but just because they don't agree with you on everything, you have to have a goal that's on the horizon that you can follow. How else would our military men and women serve our country? They certainly don't agree with everything, but they do agree that the country has to be defended. And so that's how they stand shoulder to shoulder and defend the country. And so if you don't have the ability to do that, then it puts the nation, the whole nation, in a precarious situation when its citizens can't agree on anything. But nevertheless, this speech, which was given in April of 1875, after our president, Abraham Lincoln, had been assassinated. And they erected a monument in Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C. And I was invited to be a speaker on the raising of that monument. And I can remember so many people being in the audience that day. And presidents, senators, congressmen, and so forth. And well, this is what I said. We stand here today under this monument. And ladies and gentlemen, truth is proper and beautiful at all times and all places. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit that Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. He was entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by the forces of circumstance and necessity. For while Abraham Lincoln saved for you a country, he delivered us from a bondage. Therefore, it shall be asked what we have to do with the memory of Abraham Lincoln, or what Abraham Lincoln has to do with us. The answer is, though he loved Caesar less than Rome, though the Union was more important to him than our freedom or our future, under his wise and beneficent rule, we gradually saw ourselves lifted from the depths of slavery to the heights of liberty and manhood. He was loathed and hated by the slave masters. He was loathed and hated by the freemen. He dealt with the voices in fear all around him. But he had an oath in heaven. There was not fire on earth to make this honest boatman violate that sacred oath. But dying as he did by the red hand of violence, killed, assassinated, not because of personal hate, for no man who ever knew Abraham Lincoln could hate him, but because of his fidelity to union and liberty. He is doubly dear to us. So, fellow citizens, I end as I began, in doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator. We may calmly point to the monument erected in the memory of Abraham Lincoln. Well, that's a part of the speech. I know you all have things to do this afternoon, and we do want to get to the questions. And so hopefully you all have put some questions forth that I can that I can answer.
Yes, sir. So we have one question so far in our chat, and I'm going to go ahead and leave a message in the chat so everybody can see it, can find it. So our first question is from Gretchen, and she asks, what was the earlier Emancipation Proclamation?
Yes, well, this is wow, an incredible question to ponder. That Thomas Jefferson, in the original articles founding the Constitution, offered a proclamation abolishing slavery. And it was dismissed. And before that, in the Revolutionary War, a British Lord Byron, offered up an Emancipation Proclamation to those slaves being held by Britain to fight where? On the side of Great Britain. And so the things that we were doing in our time, we were certainly not working in a vacuum. We were reading history ourselves. If you're trying to go forward into history and find out what you're going to do, you have to look back. Hopefully that history will serve the present and the future. If it doesn't, it's no good. But certainly we were aware that Lord Byron had freed the slaves, established the Ethiopian Regiment, which in turn, the rebels had no choice but to allow their slaves to fight. They had no choice but to establish the Black men and men of Massachusetts. Chris McSaddett's the first Black man to lay down his life, Black man to lay down his life for the country. And so, yes, that would have been the first, Lord Byron and the emancipating the slaves who were held by the British.
Thank you for that. Our next question is from Randy. He asks, does Mr. Douglass have any hobbies?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Well, I certainly was a person who loved to stay healthy. I would walk, I would ride my horse. If you visited my home at Cedar Hill, I certainly had devices I would use in working out and keeping fit, weights that I would use for my arms. And Cedar Hill is set right across the Anacostia River, and I would walk to work some days. And of course, I love to take walks with my dog, Frank. Frank was a wonderful, calm, mild-mannered mastiff, and we would take a walk, and then we would come back, and I would ride, and then we would walk some more. Yes.
Wonderful. Next question is from Nancy. She asks, how did your family live and manage when you were abroad?
Well, it was quite difficult. It was quite difficult to leave my wife and children, 3 at the time, in Lynn, Massachusetts. Of course, it was an environment where it was very, people were looking out for one another. And in Lynn, Anna felt quite at home. She really was a part of the social fabric of Lynn. But to leave them there without protection from the man of the house was quite an ordeal for me, and quite rough for them to live. But I was making some money. I was selling my first narrative. I sent money back home. And people criticize me sometimes because in my first narrative, I hardly mentioned my wife or children. And I am castrated for that. Well, listen, people, if you are going to write a book that exposes your wife and children to capture, to murder even, you're not going to mention them. You're not going to mention the people that you're trying to protect. Now, if you read later in my narratives, you you will find that I start giving people naming places more frequently, people, uh, those in the Underground Railroad. And even then, I mean, I really thought it quite peculiar to be talking about the Underground Railroad above ground. If it's an underground road, let it stay underground. But my wife and children were quite fond of Lynn, quite at home. When I came back and I announced that we were moving to Rochester, well, uh, they didn't want to leave. They didn't want to leave Lynn, but they found a new life in Rochester, and we stayed there about 25 years in Rochester.
Awesome. Next question comes from Michelle. She asks, can you elaborate any more about your time in Detroit? Now, this is a special question for us because we are in the Detroit area, although most of the people who are watching are in the Detroit area. So it is of special interest to us.
Yes, yes. Well, uh, I would say that I gave multiple speeches throughout the cities, um, and one city slips my mind. It's Ypsi. What is that?
Ypsilanti?
Ypsilanti. Yes, Ypsilanti, Detroit, Saginaw. Just name the cities, and anywhere, any church. I think in Detroit it was Second Baptist Church that I spoke, and John Brown found out I was there, and he came trying to convince me to go along on the raid and so forth. And so the Detroit area was full of abolitionists. You see, Detroit is situated in a parallel line with cities like Chicago, Detroit, Rochester, Buffalo. All of these northern cities were key because those of us who were helping people make it north to Canada, these cities were the thoroughfares in which many runaways either passed through or settled there. And so it was prudent for me to come up there and speak to many people who were supporting the abolitionists and those blacks who had decided to stay in America. And I came back after the raid on Harper's Ferry and the Civil War. I came back to recruit soldiers. You know, my sons, Charles and Lewis, immediately joined in the fight. They joined the 54th Regiment, and they stayed until their tour was ended. One became a first sergeant, the other was a sergeant major. And so I can certainly say that Detroit and the greater areas surrounding Detroit supported the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad.
Kay asks, how long were you in Detroit? And did you retain your connection with William Webb, if not John Brown?
Well, I don't know if you missed my earlier comments, sir. Certainly, William Webb he was, as a matter of fact, he helped me to arrange the speech at Second Baptist Church right there in Detroit. And so he was a key figure of the Underground Railroad, and I continued to trade letters with him and so forth. John Brown, as you know, shortly after leaving Detroit, he went to Pennsylvania where he would do his staging for the raid on Harper's Ferry. Now, he sent me another telegram, please meet me in Pennsylvania. And so I went to Pennsylvania to the rock quarry where he was. And well, I had to let him know that I was not going to be a part of the raid. You know, he was trying to recruit many people, including a great soldier unto herself. Harriet Tubman was also being recruited to be on that raid on Harper's Ferry. Unfortunately, you know, Aminetta had frequent spells because she had an injury when she was a girl on the plantation. And so she was not feeling well during that entire period leading up to Harper's Ferry. And so she did not go and I did not go. Yes.
All right. Chris asks, did you feel that President Lincoln initially moved too slowly?
Oh, absolutely. You see, I had been following Abraham Lincoln in his early days in Illinois when he was running for as to be a senator in Illinois, and he was debating Stephen A. Douglas with one S, the lesser Douglas. And so those speeches by both of them, more so by Mr. Lincoln, because Senator Lincoln at that time, he was very knowledgeable and had a lot of strategy. And so he was making sure that his speeches were being reprinted in the newspapers. And I was reading the newspapers and sizing up his position as to was he really an anti-slavery man? He tried to draw a fine line. He said, well, for the South, we'll leave you alone, but we want to maintain that 33rd parallel and not have any more slave states westward. And so that's how he found a happy medium and was able to make his way to the White House. And so it wasn't until during the Civil War that I actually had an opportunity to meet Abraham Lincoln, to visit him in the Oval Office and bring grievances before him and understand his reasoning, that I started to respect him and he started to respect me. He had heard of my reputation and the grievances that I brought to him when I met him, because he had already allowed the soldiers to fight. And unfortunately, there were three grievances that I brought to him. Firstly, that the Black soldier had not gotten equal pay. Secondly, that there were no Black officers in the ranks. And thirdly, that there was no such thing as a Black prisoner of war. Any Black man caught on the battlefield was immediately killed, lynched by the Confederates. And so he certainly listened intently to my arguments, and he gave me back reasonable objections. And he promised that we would get equal pay. He promised that eventually there would be officers in the ranks. You might find this interesting. What he said about the Black prisoners of war. He said, Frederick, it wouldn't be prudent for us to indiscriminately kill Confederate soldiers on behalf of some Black soldier being killed. I mean, if someone can bring me the evidence of what soldier killed or lynched a Black soldier, then we will certainly bring them to justice. But we just can't go indiscriminately taking revenge on soldiers who did not create acts of atrocity. So there is where we finally saw eye to eye, and I could see the reasoning and the intelligence of Abraham Lincoln. And then, of course, I was at his second inaugural, and I was at the inaugural party afterwards. So Abraham Lincoln and I had an evolving relationship that didn't prove itself until after he had been assassinated. As a matter of fact, I am sitting here now with this walking stick. This was sent to me by Mary Todd Lincoln about 3 months after the assassination of our dear president, with a note saying that he wanted you to have this, his favorite walking stick, out of his respect for you and the things you did to help move along this union. Yes. So that's kind of how I came to see eye to eye with Abraham Lincoln.
Wonderful. Lavera asks, while in Detroit, did you have knowledge of the Underground Railroad? Now, you said that you mentioned that you did, but could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, certainly, as I was saying before, Detroit Rochester, Buffalo, all these states along the Canadian border were instrumental in the Underground Railroad. Well, certainly we did not talk about these things. Second Baptist Church in Detroit was part of the Underground Railroad. Not the Irish, but the Friends, the Quakers, were part of the Underground Railroad. And these people were all underground. And so when we went there, we were certainly aware that there could be people who might come and try to disrupt what we were trying to do, disrupt our speeches. I'm not exactly sure if there were anyone. I'm trying to think. The times when I really met adversity in trying to give a speech somewhere were normally more south than Michigan. I found Detroit and surrounding area to be quite hospitable, and so people were making their way through Detroit, and the Black press was a big part of that. You see, I was at that time publishing my newspaper, the North Star newspaper, and so things that were happening could only be told through the publication of the Black press and other papers who supported the abolitionist movement. And so those newspapers in Detroit certainly covered my speeches and gave an account of my oratory. And so I came back to Detroit and those other cities many, many times. Yes.
Joseph asks, what would you have us do to achieve equity for all?
Well, I would say, as I said before, the United States Constitution is not a dead letter. It is a living idea. Now, the last amendment that I was able to be a witness to the Constitution was the 16th Amendment. In the speech that I made, what to the American slave is the 4th of July. Many people say that I'm criticizing the Constitution. I would beg to differ. I am not criticizing that document. I am criticizing those who might not live up to that document. As a matter of fact, the great Sidney Smith said this: for those people who claim their allegiance, Sidney Smith said this: men who talk about how great our forefathers were and founding the country. Men seldom eulogize the fame and virtues of their forefathers without avoiding some folly or wickedness of their own. Our forefathers were great men. They were peaceful men. And they came up with an idea which stands to live the test of time. But they have done their work, and they've done much of it well. And all of us are children of those men, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and so we must do our own work. We cannot live off the fortunes of our forefathers. We must do our own work. And so have we done our own work? Have we become engaged citizens? Have we taken seriously our civic responsibility? That would be the question to us. What amendments have we been trying to add to the Constitution that helps define what is already a great document? But of course, in this patriarchal society, we have men who, when the Constitution says man, now we have to define what man means. Man does just not mean the Anglo-Saxon. Man also means the Black man. And man also means woman. Woman. This is what the suffragists found out when they realized that the Haudenosaunee women were leading their nation. You see, look, Lucretia Mott with the great Indian woman of the Haudenosaunee into the Longhouse. And she was astonished that women were leading a whole nation of men making decisions. This is what ignited the suffrage movement. The women realized, in fact, that they had mistaken their privilege for rights. They had so much privilege, they thought they had rights. But the thing about privilege is it can be taken away from you by your husbands. They can decide at any minute that they're tired of you and they cast you out and take your children, your clothing, everything. And so that's what started the suffrage movement. So this goes right back around. Are you engaged in being civic responsible? You see, there are, and I would end this question with this. You have three boxes. You have the soap box, the cartridge box, the ballot box, and the cartridge box. The soap box, the ballot box, and the cartridge box. And so we certainly understood during Jubilee after emancipation, Juneteenth, I believe you all call it now, that the vote is ultimately important. If you take out the middle, if you take the ballot box, then all you have left is the soap box and the cartridge box. An argument and a fight. I hope you don't come to that again.
We've got a couple more questions about the Underground Railroad and your position on women's rights. You've discussed each of these things a little bit at length. Is there anything more you would like to add about either of those things?
No, I certainly would say, though, something that I haven't talked about is, teaching myself how to read and write. That was essential to accomplishing the things that I was able to accomplish in my lifetime. And certainly, if there are any children, if there are any parents watching with their children, I taught Sabbath school. After I learned how to read and write, I started trying to teach my fellow men and women in bondage how to read and write. I wasn't posing as a preacher. I certainly believe in Christ. I'm a Christian, but I certainly wanted to help my fellow men and women learn how to read and write. And so education is a big part of success. And if you're sending your children to school, you certainly are trying to build strong children. You cannot build strong children. You have to build strong children so that you won't have to repair broken men. That's why you're sending your children to school. And so, and hopefully the schools you're sending them to are not teaching them what to think, but how to think. When I brought my children from Lynn to Rochester, I was trying to get them a good education. I wanted someone to teach them critical thinking, to read both sides of an argument and have them make up their own intelligent minds. I get the best questions from children as I travel on my speaking tours. So that's certainly an important thing that I would want to add if there are no other questions.
There are plenty of other questions. We've got lots and lots. And in fact, we may not get to all of these because we will have to end our time with you here at 8:30 p.m. But we've still got quite a bit of time. Yeah, we have no shortage of questions here. So this is a quick question. Cynthia asks, did you provide the title for the speech that you gave at the erection of the Lincoln Memorial?
At the speech that I did earlier tonight, yes, that was called Oration on the Memory of Abraham Lincoln. That was a speech that I gave in April of 1875 at the raising of what is called the Emancipation Monument. It depicts Abraham Lincoln standing with one hand on the Emancipation Proclamation and reaching out to help up uh, a, 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 a slave. He is rising.
Next question, did you help create any public services to help those newly freed slaves after the war between the states?
Yes, I did. Well, I, well, this was something peculiar. You know, as I travel uh, into the modern era, I find out some peculiar things. Now, one of the places, this was called Freedom Town in Washington, D.C., where I went many times into this community of newly freed citizens to teach them to have classes on reading and writing. I helped organize that. We raised money so that they could, you know, help establish themselves. And now I came back to visit and speak with the historical society there in Alexandria, and I find out that there's now a graveyard. I think there are soldiers buried there in the National Cemetery. I believe it's called Omaha Beach, Omaha. The Omaha section of the National Cemetery was once Freedom Town. Yes.
Right. So Tom says, my understanding is that at their founding, the US tried to suppress the success of Haiti as a means of discouraging uprisings in the US. His question is, did that change by the time that you served as the ambassador? And what did you advocate for? And what role did you play as the ambassador to Haiti?
Well, I would have you know that many people did not want me to go to Haiti. They tried every way. They tried to pit the Haitians against me, as well as they did John Mercer Langston. I went down there and I served that country. I certainly knew the history of the country and that they were the first to stand up under the great Toussaint Louverture and give the world a sense of the Negro's manhood. And so my time there as ambassador was somewhat short-lived and not accomplishing as much as I would have wanted to accomplish. And I said as much in a speech in 1893 at the Chicago World's Fair. Chicago World's Fair was a grand event, world event, in which they were showcasing races of people, inventions, goods, wares, businesses, and so forth. And so myself and other people went to the Chicago World's Fair. And it just so happens that at the Chicago World's Fair, they erected a monument, a tribute to the country of Haiti. There were a lot of Haitian people living in Chicago at that time. And I gave a speech called Oration on Haiti, in which if you think What to the American Slave was a challenge to the ear, that speech is a challenge to the ear, because Haiti, although those people should be more respected especially by the colored people of the United States more than all others, they are ostracized. They are, although they have French clothing, French language, they are still met with a cold shoulder. And it's because Haiti is Black. And she has not yet been forgiven for being Black, for standing up for her own freedom. And I might add as a side note as well, Santo Domingo, I was sent to Santo Domingo on an expedition to see if that country could be annexed into as a part of America. And I was criticized for that. Why would you go down to a country and in all effective terms, help to recolonize an independent country. Well, I was thinking about this thing I spoke about before. Yes, I was thinking about the vote, that a whole nation of colored men would mean, based on the 16th Amendment, that we would have whole millions of colored men voting. So that was my motivation for being part of that expedition to Santo Domingo. So that part of the country, I didn't turn my back on it. Many Black men didn't turn their back on it, but as a whole, the nation, they ostracized. And I hopefully that Haiti is not being ostracized today.
Here's a question about the North Star paper. How long did you publish the North Star?
Well, not as long as I had hoped. Certainly, 2 or 3 years under the title The North Star, and then you see, I couldn't make up my mind really on speaking or the newspaper. We had in some cases 5,000 copies, and the paper was being published overseas. 2 cents subscription for a week, which sounds like pennies in your time, but 2 cents still was, trying to keep the paper in Black. And I'm not a man of numbers, I'm a man of words. And so by the time that my daughter Rosetta came to me and she said, "Father, the numbers are not adding up for the North Star." And then I called Julia Griffiths, who has been supporting my family and tutoring my children and all of that. We were not able to save the paper. So we changed the paper, and I found a partnership, and we started calling it the Douglass Papers. And so all in all, 5, 6, 7 years that we were able to publish. And there was another newspaper when I moved to Washington, D.C., that they convinced me that I should take it over, and they thought that my name on the paper would make it run well. So I ended up giving that over to my sons, and they ran it for a couple of years, and then they in fact sold it as well. So, but the initial years of the North Star in Rochester ran off of Main Street. We certainly made an impact on society in helping the Underground Railroad. I tried to write a newspaper that could be read by all. I frequently republished poems, excerpts from Uncle Tom's Cabin, and so forth. And so I hope, and I certainly hope that the Black press is still alive and well in the modern era.
To your knowledge, were your family members, for example, your grandmother or your siblings, were they able to become free ever? And did you know about your father?
Well, my mother died when I was 6 years old. My grandmother died as well. My master put her out after years, after her entire life of bearing children for him to sell and work. She passed away. He put her out into a house and let her fend for herself. My sister and brother, Eliza and Perry, they were sold around the time of the Civil War. Many slaves were being sold out of the mid-Atlantic states. So they were sold out west. As a matter of fact, I think Perry was sold out to Texas. But I was able to, after my emancipation, after the Civil War, was able to go find them. And I found a couple of my aunts, some uncles. As for my father, many may not know, was most certainly my slave master. Captain Anthony. And so I eventually went back to St. Michael's. I first wrote him a letter, and then I went back and I sat beside his bed, not to create any sort of revenge or so forth, but just to let him know, see the man that he had once held as chattel property, as an accomplished man with a family of his own, who only wanted the same thing that he wanted in life: a home, family, to be around him at his death. Yeah.
Tom asks, did Black Americans at the time ever work in partnership with Native Americans or vice versa to fight for each other's freedom?
Yes, absolutely. There were many coalitions of Black men and natives, Black men and Irish. You see, with especially the further south you go, then land is being taken away from the native, the Indian. And so they're finding it hard, as hard as we are, to feed themselves. And they understood our predicament. And so, especially those runaways, we depended on natives to help show us the way, to help us with nourishment so that we wouldn't starve in the swamps and so forth. And as I had mentioned earlier, if it had not been for the Iroquois Nation and the Haudenosaunee, they were the ones that introduced the white woman to the fact that her privilege was not rights. To see Native American women leading the men was an eye-opening experience. And so, yes, we had many collaborations with the natives.
Another one. What was your position on women's rights?
Well, I stood up for women's rights. I was the master of ceremony at the first women's suffrage convention in Seneca Falls in July of 1848. You see, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, well, no, I stand corrected. Susan B. Anthony did not come on the scene until after that convention. A couple of years later, they had a follow-up convention in Syracuse, and that is where Susan B. Anthony got involved. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Mrs. Mott, the McClintocks in Waterloo, they had a meeting at Mrs. McClintock's house, and this is where they wrote what is called the Declaration of Sentiments. Now, ladies, if you have not heard of this document, you need to go find it immediately. The Declaration of Sentiments is a parody on the Declaration of Independence, and it is a document in which the women are laying out what they envision their rights to be under the Constitution, under a free America. And so they drafted this document, the Declaration of Sentiments, and then they had the convention for signatures, for people to sign the document, and then that would in turn be travel all over the country to gain more signatures. And so I was there on that Sunday and gave a speech at the church, at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls. Yes, so I supported the women's rights. Of course, as I said before, you cannot let purity sabotage progress. And so I understood that these women, many of the white women had, well, they were not fully engaged in the Black man's plight. They certainly thought that they should get the right to vote before the Black man got the right to vote. So there are so many different dynamics here. Of course, the reason I'm supporting the woman's right to vote is because I have a wife and I have a daughter, and I want them to be able to vote. Now, the difference between Anna Mary and Rosetta is that they are carrying two weights, one of race, one of sex. The white woman only carries that of sex because race is to her favor. But regardless of these dynamics, we were still able to fight side by side for years and years until we were not able to convince the men to vote the woman's right to vote, and then that's where we fell apart.
All right, we've got time for a couple more questions. Here's the first one. Did you find any of your autobiographies harder to write than the others?
Yeah, certainly the first one was the hardest to write. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass was the hardest to write because I still had some fear, and I had to be careful in who not to expose those people who had contributed to my good fortune of gaining my freedom. And then after that, my bondage and my freedom, I'm now a free man, and I can look back and make a more critical look at my past. And then, of course, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. I wouldn't have written it unless people were really trying to encourage me to write another narrative. By that time, people were writing my biography, and as a matter of fact, Booker T. Washington was writing a narrative of me. We were good friends. He had invited me to speak at Tuskegee when he established the Tuskegee Institute, and so I'd gone down there and I spoke at their commencement. So I felt that it wasn't necessary to write a third narrative, but I did. Yes.
All right, and then maybe we've got time for a couple more. What did you ever dream of being an orator before you gave your first public speech?
Yes, as I was saying, when I purchased this book, The Columbian Orator, that's what that book is all about. It's a school book at the time, and at that time, children were expected to be able to read and write and recite out loud, not just for their peers. The entertainment of the day was speeches. When you came to a speech, to a rally, there were multiple speakers who would speak for more than an hour. Can you imagine standing outside and there are 5 speakers and each of them are going to speak for an hour long? Oratory was a tremendous popular skill set at the time. And so in this book, The Columbian Orator, there are instructions on how to be a public speaker. There are people who contributed to this school book with instruction from Cicero on how to be a public speaker. Can you imagine, even in that time, that Cicero would be giving instruction on forensics?
Wonderful. And I've gotten a couple comments that the audio from my end is coming through a little bit crackly. So to everybody, I apologize for that. All right, we've got time for one more question. Somebody asked, did you ever meet W.E.B. Du Bois?
No. I get these questions. I was born in 1818. One thing I find out about the modern era is they, for whatever reason, in the reading and the interpretation of history, is that they create narratives about various philosophies. And I've been asked questions about the difference in my philosophy versus someone else's philosophy. So the first thing that I would ask is, when was this person born? And if this person was born anytime and was my junior, significantly my junior, if they were 10, 11, 12 years old, how could I possibly have a difference in philosophy with an 8-year-old? But somehow it's being conjectured in the modern era that I had some sort of difference in philosophy with the men of your time, so to speak. But certainly there were many, many great men who contributed and had their own philosophies about how, certainly Booker T. Washington, he was a man of letters. He was from the college class. He was born in Virginia, but he made his way to the classroom and became the leader of an institution. So I said this much in my speech, self-made men. There are many paths to becoming successful. Be you in the college class, the farmer, the orator, the artist, the musician, the doctor, the scientist, Benjamin Banneker. There's so many different paths to success.
All right, well, miraculously, we have made it through all of our questions. I just recently, just now had a comment come through. Somebody is thanking you, said, Mr. Douglass, I have thoroughly enjoyed learning from you tonight. Excellent program, and thank you so much. And I can assure you that that sentiment is shared with all of us here today, including myself.
Yes, and I got so many questions on Detroit, and so I understand you all are undergoing a pandemic right now, and the reason your mistress of ceremony is wearing the mask. But hopefully, after this is over, and I might have some tips on how to navigate a pandemic, the yellow fever. But you can invite me to Detroit. And I'm sure once I am standing on the ground I stood on 150 years ago, my memory will come back to me and I might remember some other things about the great city of Detroit.
Well, I speak on behalf of all of us and I say thank you so much for being here tonight and for sharing your story with all of us.
Thank you, citizen. Thank you, Detroit, and the great state of Michigan.
And that, everybody, will conclude our program for tonight. We hope you have enjoyed, and everyone have a safe and lovely night.